I received a question today from one of the local mammal rehabilitators. She has a skunk that she believes has developed metabolic bone disease. He's got a fracture in the spinal column. She actually had messaged me earlier asking for a dosage reference on calcium gluconate, which is a calcium supplement. It's often used in reptiles. One of the most common diseases that reptiles in captivity can't get is metabolic bone disease. I just wanted to go ahead and try to explain this as concisely as possible, although this is a subject which can be rather technical and involved. This disease or disorder is highly prevalent in captive reptiles when you have lesser knowledgeable keepers who let their reptiles fall into imbalances with their calcium and phosphorus balance and sunlight and everything else. So I'm going to try as best as possible to break this down to you and explain to you what's happening with that. This is going to be good. If you're a reptile keeper, you absolutely need to pay attention. Even if you don't take away everything I'm explaining here, you'll retain something. Most of all, you'll understand the complexity of the systems. That goes for any rehabilitator as well. If you're rehabilitating reptiles, you definitely need to know something about this. Birds are subject to this as well. Also mammals. A lot of you mammal rehabilitators deal with skunks and raccoons and opossums that will get MBD or rickets. A lot of times it's your youngsters. So everybody should be able to take something away from this. When you hear MBD, what is that actually? A metabolic bone disease, metabolic bone disorder. It's sometimes known by both names. It's more commonly in reptiles known as nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. You've got a thyroid gland and a parathyroid gland, and they serve different functions. In diagnosed cases of metabolic bone disease, that's going to be the parathyroid gland that's involved in that. There are actually three kinds of parathyroidism. You can have primary or secondary or tertiary. I won't get into all that right now. Usually when you're dealing with metabolic bone disease and in reptiles, you're dealing with the nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. You have a overactive parathyroid gland, usually caused by a nutritional deficit. Now, even it could be related to lack of sunlight and everything too, but it still falls back to nutritional because the sunlight, I'll show you. What causes this usually is hypocalcemia or hyperphosphatemia. What those are fancy terms for is you've got low blood calcium or you have high blood phosphorus. Whenever that happens, the parathyroid gland senses that you either have depressed calcium or elevated phosphorus. If you're familiar with reptile nutrition, you've probably heard or read somewhere that you ideally want your calcium intake to be higher than your phosphorus, usually a 2-to-1 ratio, and that's to prevent this sort of thing from happening. What happens whenever the parathyroid gland senses that you've got a low serum calcium condition or a hyperphosphatemia, high phosphorus, what will happen is the parathyroid gland releases a hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone. What it's trying to do is maintain a proper serum calcium homeostasis. Your body is trying to maintain high enough levels of calcium in the blood. If there's not high enough levels of calcium circulating in the blood, the parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone. Okay? The reason for this is manyfold. You need calcium, not just for healthy bones and teeth. Calcium is very important for a lot of metabolic functions. Cardiac function. Your heart needs calcium, your muscles need calcium, A lot of systems in the body rely on calcium, and if you have low blood calcium, this it doesn't only cause issues with your bone density and things like that. If you have a low enough blood calcium level, you can go into cardiac arrest, go into a coma. So calcium is extremely important for a lot of things beyond just bone health. Parathyroid gland senses that, releases parathyroid hormone. This is very ingenious what the body does to counteract this if it senses that there is low blood calcium. The parathyroid hormone acts on cells in your bones. It stimulates the activation of these cells called osteoclasts. Now, the osteoclast is a type of cell in your bone that starts to break down your bone. Well, why would your body want to create these osteoclasts and break down your bone? Well, because calcium, again, is so important to so many other things: neurological function, cardiac function, and muscular strength and everything else like that, that it says, hey, what's a ready source? If we're not getting enough calcium in the diet, what's a ready source of calcium? It's in the bone. And what bone is a combination of calcium and phosphorus, calcium phosphate. That makes bone. What the body does is it tells the parathyroid, hey, make some parathyroid hormone, go into the bones, activate those cells, and tell them to break down some of that bone so we can get the calcium out of it. That's called bone resorption, and it releases those minerals back into the blood supply because your body's trying to maintain that blood homeostasis levels, because it's not good enough that it's just bound up and stored in the bones. That's good for the bone density and bone strength and everything else, but you still need excess calcium circulating. You need a reservoir of that in your blood supply too, because as I said, it's used in many other systems. That's what the parathyroid is trying to do by releasing this hormone, activating the osteoclast to break down that bone so it can get calcium into your blood. What can lead to the hypocalcemia or the hyperphosphatemia? One of the primary reasons in captive animals is going to be diet or lack of proper ultraviolet lighting or access to sunlight. Poor diet is responsible a lot of the times. That's why I tell a lot of you people to avoid canned, pelletized, processed foods as a staple for these animals, and to use as many fresh and natural items as you can. A lot of your canned commercial diets will usually be very high in phosphorus. You need to pay attention to your calcium and phosphorus ratios again. Phosphorus is very critical as well. It's not that phosphorus is bad. Phosphorus is very critical too. It's just that you can't have it out of balance with the calcium. You need to have more calcium in the body than you do phosphorus. That's why generally you never need to be supplemented with phosphorus, because you're going to get enough of that in any kind of diet. You'll never see added phosphorus or phosphate, advertised as a selling point, but you will see, added calcium. So poor diet, poor nutrition leads to all this, or a lack of ultraviolet B radiation. This is highly important for all animals, reptiles in particular. Beyond the diet or lack of sunlight or UVB exposure, one of the other causes of MBD could be, and this happens a lot in cats, is chronic kidney disease, chronic renal failure. The reason for that is whenever you have kidney disorder, one thing that they're not going to be able to do is excrete enough of the phosphorus. Kidneys need to be able to excrete that. So whenever you've got kidney disease, that might not be happening. You could be retaining too much phosphorus, which throws this calcium out of balance. Also, in chronic kidney disease or chronic renal failure, you could have the kidneys failing to activate enough, quote, vitamin D3, unquote. The kidneys are responsible for activating vitamin D3. A lot of you who keep reptiles, I know everybody's heard of vitamin D3. If you have kept reptiles for any length of time, especially if you're, a serious hobbyist or anything, you've heard of D3, you've seen it advertised in the calcium supplements and things like that. Okay, everybody refers to that as a vitamin, all right? It's not really a vitamin. D3, which is also known as cholecalciferol, it's actually a calcium uptake regulating hormone, and I consider it a drug. If not used properly, it is very dangerous. It's actually a fat-soluble substance. If you overdose an animal on this D3, it's very hard to treat for that because unlike you've probably never heard of a vitamin C overdose or a vitamin B overdose. Those are vitamin B and vitamin C would be examples of water-soluble vitamins. Vitamin D is one of those that's fat soluble. Once you overdose on it and it gets bound to fat, it's not eliminated easily. It's a lot more dangerous when you reach a certain overdose threshold. I have done necropsies on animals that died because they got too much D3. I don't think that the average hobbyist reptile keeper really should be messing with D3. You can't really effectively regulate the dose that you're giving, and most people overuse it. It's not necessary to use it especially if you have a good UVB lamp or your animal is getting a regular access to unfiltered sunlight. It doesn't need D3 supplementation, and you can actually overdose the animal quite easily if you've got good UVB lights or your animal's going outside and you're giving it vitamin D3 as well. What D3 actually does, it's not calcium, it's a hormone. It tells your intestines how much calcium needs to be absorbed from the diet. If your body does not have enough D3, what it assumes is that, we must not need all this calcium then. So you can have a situation where you're giving a lot of calcium supplementation, but then the body, in the absence of having enough D3 hormone to tell it to absorb that calcium from the intestines, it's going to flush it out. It's going to excrete it if it does not sense the D3 hormone telling it to absorb the calcium. Reptile keepers especially, they'll hear, MBD, 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 and they don't really have any idea what it is. They just think, it's I got to give calcium. My animal's not getting enough calcium, and they think they can fix it by giving high doses of calcium and or with vitamin D3. No. If you go about this the wrong way, you can make matters worse or kill your animal. This is very, as you can see, kind of complex things going on here. D3, where do we get D3? It doesn't just come in powders and supplements. I would recommend you stay away from that stuff. There's a specific dosing that actually, D3 is in my reptile formularies listed as a drug to be given in doses of maximum of 2,000 milligrams per kilogram once every 14 days. And in most of these supplements, they'll give you a minimum and maximum analysis that could be this wide margin. There's no real quality control, a good way to nail down how much D3 exactly is in each gram or whatever of calcium supplement you're using. You could very easily be overdosing your animal. It can lead to a very nasty death. I'll get to that in a minute. Run back through this again. If there's not enough D3, then it's going to think, we don't need to absorb all this calcium, so it's going to flush it out. D3, it's produced from the UVB component in sunlight. Sunlight's composed of UVA, UVB, UVC, infrared, all this sort of thing. But the frequency of light that is responsible in sunlight for producing this vitamin D3 is the band known as UVB. It's not good enough to just have a light that says, oh, reptile light, this is meant for reptile basking. If it doesn't say UVB, then you haven't got the right light. It has to be a quality UVB source. The best in the world, the lights that I recommend are made by a company called Arcadia. They're produced in the UK, and you can find those on a website called reptilebasics.com. Arcadia Lamps at reptilebasics.com, and I recommend the Arcadia T5HO, which means it's a T5 fixture, a T5 fluorescent tube lamp, like they go over an aquarium, a linear tube fluorescent lamp. So T5 fixture, HO, high output, made by Arcadia. Those are the best in the world, best made UV lamps in the world for reptiles and birds. That's not just my opinion. That's based on independent testing and research done by a veterinarian who is also the world's leading authority on reptile and bird UV lighting. Her name is Dr. Frances Baines, Baines, and she's on YouTube too. So she does independent testing of ultraviolet lamps. By far the best made in the world right now as we speak are Arcadia lamps. What happens is the UVB, we go outside, you've probably heard this before or been taught this in science class at some point, that you go outside, the UVB from the sunlight strikes your skin. That produces vitamin D. It produces the inactive form of vitamin D. Skin produces the vitamin D, the inactive precursor. Then it needs the kidneys to activate it. Your kidneys is actually the organ that activates this into vitamin D3, which then tells your intestines to absorb the calcium from your diet so that it's not excreted. That's where the UVB or the sunlight comes in. You'll hear a lot of people say that, snakes don't need to have the UVB lamps. I disagree with that. I think snakes, and it's been proven through actual veterinary research now, that snakes and leopard geckos, other crepuscular, which means active at dusk and dawn, or nocturnal animals, actually do benefit from, and they do have the cells and the receptors and everything in their bodies to take advantage of the UVB and producing the vitamin D3. So they need it too. It's just in lesser, they need it in lesser quantities. And the reason for that is like in the case of the snakes, or this could be, opossums, skunks, any animal that's eating whole, like rodent prey. If they're eating, whole, mice, rats, or any other kind of animal, if they're eating the liver and especially the kidneys of the whole prey, when they do that, they're getting the benefits of the D3 also. So it's sort of when a snake swallows a rat or a mouse, it's getting the benefit of digesting the kidneys, and it's getting the D3 as well. So that doesn't mean it needs no sunlight or no UVB. That's false. It's in a better position versus an insectivore who is going to be more reliant on needing this UVB or sunlight exposure. Your body makes this D3 as needed. The body is not going to overproduce. It's not going to overdose itself on the D3. One of the reasons why I don't recommend people use the D3, it can be very dangerous because it's fat soluble. Once you overdose on it, there's almost nothing you can do about it because it's bound up to fat and can't easily be eliminated. Direct supplementation of the vitamin D3, it bypasses the body's self-regulation. Whenever you're supplementing D3 in a calcium powder, you're getting in the way of the safety mechanisms of the body's own safety mechanisms for regulating how much D3 that it's making. you're bypassing those natural safeties and you're just forcing the D3 onto the animal. Again, if you don't know what you're doing and you have not calculated out these dosages, milligrams per kilogram, and on what schedule, if you haven't done an actual analysis of how many milligrams of D3 are in your supplement per gram or whatever, and you haven't worked this out as a dose like it's a drug, then you don't know what you're doing, and you shouldn't be messing with it, because it bypasses the body's safety mechanisms to make sure that it's not overdosed. If your animal is also getting UVB exposure or exposure to natural sunlight, it's going to be making the D3. Then you're giving it direct supplementation too. Going to be a lot more likely that you're going to overdose the animal on that. Now, I've actually clinically seen this before in animals, reptiles that I've done necropsy on, where the keeper overused D3. Like at every feeding, there was one case in particular, a veiled chameleon. The girl, pretty much every day that she fed her chameleon, she was dusting the chameleon's crickets with calcium that had D3. It killed the chameleon, and I've seen numerous cases where this has happened. What it leads to is a condition called dystrophic calcification. What that basically means is the organ tissues get calcified. It's a very slow, painful, horrible. It's a horrible death for an animal to go through. In the case of this chameleon, her intestines, her pericardial sac surrounding her heart, her gallbladder, her kidneys had calcified. Everything got hard because of calcium deposits. It got to where she was her heart was having trouble beating because the sac around the heart had started calcifying. Her intestines, she would have been in an extreme amount of pain because of these calcium deposits everywhere. The reason for that is it's absorbed too much calcium that wasn't needed from the intestines. Since there was an excess, the body couldn't excrete that calcium. It was not given the chance to say, oh, we've got enough calcium, let's flush the rest. Because what it sensed was, we've got all this input D3, we've got this excess D3, the body must really be telling us that we're low on blood calcium, we needed to absorb more of this calcium. So instead of safely flushing that calcium, which would normally happen, all that excess D3 caused the intestines to absorb all that calcium, and then it's got to go somewhere. There's enough in the bones, where do we put it? It has to be put somewhere. So then what it starts to do is deposit the excess calcium in the organ tissues, in the intestines, in the kidneys, in the heart, in the lungs. Things start getting calcified. That's called dystrophic calcification. And like I said, it's extremely painful for the animal. Do not mess with D3. You get yourself a quality UVB lamp, or your animal has access to natural sunlight, and you are not going to need a D3 supplement. If you're doing things the right way, you should not have a D3 supplement. If you've got metabolic bone disease, again, just to recap, metabolic bone disease, generally caused by low blood calcium or high blood phosphorus. If your calcium or phosphorus is out of whack, you got more phosphorus and too little calcium. Parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone. It's trying to maintain enough calcium in the blood. So then that goes over to the bone and tells the osteoclast to start breaking down that bone and releasing free calcium into the blood so that it can be used. Poor diet or a lack of ultraviolet lighting can lead to all that, because lack of ultraviolet lighting will lead to a lack of enough vitamin D3. A lack of enough vitamin D3 will lead to a lack of calcium, enough calcium being absorbed in the intestines. Another possible cause of that, besides dietary, lack of UVB lighting, which causes the lack of vitamin D3, another possible cause is chronic kidney disease, chronic renal failure, because your kidneys are the organ that have to activate the vitamin D3, or excretion of phosphorus. In chronic kidney disease, chronic renal failure, kidneys are not operating properly. They may not be excreting as much phosphorus as fast as they need to. Elevated blood phosphorus again. Treatment for that. It's not as simple as I fight with people all the time. You reptile keepers, you read a little bit of information from somewhere, and you think you know something, and you just go off. They say a little bit of information is dangerous. Well, it is. It can be, because a lot of people hear this, MBD, or they see something going on with their animal, and they automatically assume that they're dealing with MBD, and they just right off think, oh, well, I must need more D3, or I must need more, calcium. Usually, if you are dealing with a confirmed case of metabolic bone disease that ideally should be checked with chemistries, you're going to want to do blood labs to find out what are your calcium and phosphorus ratios in the blood. What's the serum calcium and serum phosphorus levels at, and also, do you have what's the presence of parathyroid hormone? What are the parathyroid hormone levels in the blood? Blood chemistries. If you're going to a vet and you suspect MBD, blood chemistries are important to nail that down, and it's going to tell you a lot more about what's going on. In most cases, what's happening is you'll have phosphorus that's elevated in the blood. Calcium and phosphorus bind each other. So when you have an actual case of MBD, a lot of times you could have excess phosphorus, and it would be bad to do what's called boluses, or large infusions of calcium supplements, before you've dealt with any excess phosphorus. Why? Because if you do that, you're risking this dystrophic calcification. It's going to bind together and start depositing in soft tissue. You want the body to get the calcium, and you want it to not be bound up and unavailable, unavailable, and you don't want soft tissues like the intestines to start calcifying. So what you need to do is deal with any possible hyperphosphatemia first. What I generally recommend people do is use phosphate binders first. When that gets into the gut, it's going to bind that phosphorus and prevent it from being absorbed. So then it's going to give your kidneys enough time to excrete any excess phosphorus that's in the blood supply. You want to do that before you give large supplementation of calcium. Deal with the possible elevated phosphorus first by using a diet that's low in phosphorus. Make sure the dietary phosphorus is low, or you need to use a supplement with something like aluminum hydroxide in it that's gonna bind up that phosphorus before you start giving calcium supplementation. And I would do that, a couple of hours. You give that with the food, the phosphate binder with the food that you're given, and then give it a couple of hours before you give any calcium supplementation, so that you're sure that phosphorus has been bound up. So you're not going to get that calcium and phosphorus binding together and causing soft tissue calcification. Another way that this metabolic bone disease is often treated, if you got elevated parathyroid hormone, which again you would ideally want to confirm in your blood chemistries. Calcitonin is a drug that's it's a hormone. It's also prescribed as a drug, but it's a hormone that's produced by your actual thyroid gland. Remember I said you have a thyroid and you have a parathyroid. The thyroid gland produces the calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone that counteracts the parathyroid hormone. It inhibits the action of the parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is a hormone that counteracts parathyroid hormone. It stops the osteoclast from breaking down your bone. It forces the calcium to stay in your bone. And it does that by, there's osteoclasts have a receptor site. The calcitonin fits the receptor site on the osteoclast cells. So it forces those cells to pretty much be inactivated and forces that calcium to stay in the bone. Therefore, it negates the effect of the parathyroid hormone. You may need to also treat with calcitonin. That's basically about as simple as I can explain this process. I was not able to learn this overnight. When I first started out, I was, God, I'll never get all this. That was, nearly probably 15 years ago. It took a while for me to get all this. You don't need to understand all this now. Just the big takeaways from this is understand that MBD does not simply mean lack of calcium or lack of D3. There are many factors that can cause this. One of these hyperparathyroidisms, the primary hyperparathyroidism can actually be caused by tumors in the parathyroid gland. So it's not always related to this, but understand that you don't just simply correct this by starting to give them supplements with calcium or D3. If you don't do something right, you can really screw things up for them. You can cause something like dystrophic calcification, and you can end up killing them. You have to take into account that they're likely to have elevated phosphorus levels in the blood, and you're probably going to need to deal with that before you start giving your calcium supplementation. You also want to make sure that you're not dealing with any kind of kidney disease. You need to check to make sure your diet is good, low on the phosphorus. You need to make sure that your animal has a good quality UVB source, like I said, such as Arcadia Lamps, or access to unfiltered. That means no glass, no fine mesh screen in between your animal and the UVB source, be that a lamp or sunlight. The reason is glass is made to block out a lot of the UV rays. So if you've got glass or you've got a fine mesh screen top to your aquarium that's got those little fine, like screen door mesh, that's blocking your UVB. Your UVB is going to bounce right off of it. So that's what I mean when I say unfiltered UVB. You need to either have your animals in an outdoor enclosure or take them outside for unfiltered ultraviolet light exposure, or you can't have a screen. You need to have a 1/4 inch mesh or bigger. If you're going to use a screen lid over an aquarium, you need to have a good quality UVB lamp. With UVB lights, you get what you pay for. If you buy one of those $30 curly Q lamps at the pet store, that's a crap lamp, and you're buying crap, and that's what you're going to get. Those things are only good about 2 inches away from the animal. You get what you pay for. This can be caused by diet, the UVB aspects, not enough D3 because of the lack of UVB, not enough calcium in the diet, or too much phosphorus in the diet. Kidney disease leads to not enough D3 being activated that the body needs to absorb the calcium, or your phosphorus level in the blood being too high because the kidneys are damaged and they're not getting rid of the phosphorus that's building up in the blood. Body will make as much D3 as it needs, unless you've got some other condition like kidney disease going on. So understand this. Don't try to deal with this sort of thing on your own. If you don't know about this stuff, that's what that's why we have veterinarians out there, and I would recommend blood chemistries be done. That'll really tell you the tale here if you are dealing with metabolic bone disease or not, because the blood chemistry is going to show you if your calcium is too low, your phosphorus is too high, do you have a lot of parathyroid hormone circulating in the blood, that sort of thing. And if so, the veterinarian can also they can give you the calcitonin that'll suppress the parathyroid hormone so that the bone does not continue to be broken down, and phosphate binders to bind up that phosphorus. There you go. Like I said, that's about as simple as I can make it. I don't expect you all to take away everything that I just ran through. This is just so that you get a grasp of how all the things that you need to consider, how all these things can tie together and cause some serious disease. A lot of times you'll see, like a rubber jaw in iguanas or bearded dragons or something like that. Their bones will start to deform when the bones start to be weakened because the parathyroid is leaching the calcium out of the bones. When the bones get weak, the muscles will be, they'll have tension on those bones and they'll bow them out of place. The muscles are pulling on those bones, and they start to warp them. So that's why in cases of metabolic bone disease, you'll see the spine's kinked up. You'll see the jaws are kind of bent out of place, and the jaws are excessively soft. Long bones in the legs and things like that will be bowed. The weakness of the bones, they're being acted upon by the tendons and ligaments and the muscles, pulling them into a deformity. It can really be quite serious. Can lead to death. Just if it's left to run its course, not just through fractures and everything, but like the name says, this is a metabolic disease. And eventually, if it's not treated correctly, it can do more than just causing, a hip fracture, a leg fracture, a spinal fracture. It can lead to some serious cascades of metabolic disorders to organ failure. It can lead to death if untreated because it's going to damage so many other things. Anyway, I hope you found a little bit of appreciation for how complex this is, and that this is one of the reasons why you can't just run to some Facebook group and have some neophyte there explain to you how you deal with MBD. Oh, just run down and get the reptile with the vitamin D3 in it. No, it's if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be doing more harm than good. Hope you enjoyed the video and that you stayed around for the entire thing. I know it was quite long, but I hope you found it informative.